It's time now for a look at the day's top business news with Brian Quinn, and starting with Syria, where the new government plans to privatise large parts of the economy in a bid for the country to rejoin the international community.
After more than a decade of civil war, the militant group that toppled Bashar al-Assad to become Syria's de facto ruler say they're planning a new drive to privatize state-owned ports and factories. They want to get the country's shattered economy back on its feet. But to do so, they say they'll need international sanctions on the country lifted. Aleta Gadeva reports.
After more than 2 decades of Assad-era pariah economy, Syria's new government plans to go in a new direction, privatizing many previously state-owned resources.
The economy in the future will be open, and we will open the road for the foreign investment in Syria, and also we need to make big partnership with the neighborhood and also with the world.
The foreign minister plans to privatize oil, cotton and furniture factories and explore public-private partnerships to encourage investment into airports, railways and roads. But the first priorities include securing water, bread, electricity and fuel for the population, plus sanctions relief. Nearly 1 month after the fall of the Assad regime, Washington granted a 6-month exemption for some sanctions to allow the entry of humanitarian aid. Western leaders are now weighing the prospect of lifting more.
But it is in the interest of us all to engage in order to make things move in the direction of an inclusive form of governance in Syria. And I think some gesture must be made, namely in relation to the sanctions, in order to help to make it possible.
But sanctions might not be the only thing standing in the way of an open market reform. The idea was tested by Bashar al-Assad himself, who undertook privatization efforts in the 2000s. But the move revealed long-standing inefficiencies of Syria's domestic industries, worsened inequalities and sent corruption skyrocketing in the country.
And next, China is taking new measures to prop up its struggling stock markets.
The Chinese government has announced that it's ordering the country's pensions and mutual funds to put more of their investments into domestic equities, which are known as A-shares. Mutual funds have been directed to increase their A-shares holdings by at least 10% per year for the next 3 years. Commercial insurance funds, meanwhile, expected to pump 30% of their annual revenues from new premiums into A-shares starting this year. China's stock markets still have not recovered their peak from before the global financial crisis of 2008. That lack of gains, along with a severe downturn in the country's real estate market, has weighed on consumer sentiment, slowing domestic demand and economic growth. So far, previous efforts by the government to boost domestic consumption have fallen relatively flat. China's securities regulator, though, once again painting an optimistic picture of the latest efforts. Here he is.
The implementation of various measures in the plan will further enhance the equity allocation capacity of medium and long-term funds, steadily expand the scale of investment, improve the supply and structure of funds in the capital market, and consolidate the good situation of the capital market's recovery.
And has this been having any effect on the markets themselves?
Well, China's top mainland index, the Shanghai Composite, is indeed making some gains on Thursday, though they remain moderate. The threat of new tariffs from Donald Trump still casting a shadow over exporters there. Hong Kong, though, not getting that same bump. It shed early gains to lose just under 0.5%. The Nikkei in Tokyo, though, gaining around 0.8% as Japanese exports beat expectations in December. Here in Europe, meanwhile, major indexes opening relatively flat on Thursday after notching record highs yesterday. Trepidation starting to set in on the markets as Donald Trump gets set to address the World Economic Forum in Davos via video link Thursday, with many expecting a combative approach to trade with the EU.
And as the EU waits for that video address from Trump at Davos, the bloc is struggling to formulate a unified response to his threats for a renewed trade war.
Indeed. Trump has not only threatened a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, along with 10% additional levies on Chinese-made goods that could start as early as next month. He's also taking aim at Europe, calling it a big abuser, as he accused it of running an excessive trade imbalance with the U.S. EU members have taken different positions on how to navigate Trump's threats. Eliza Herbert takes a closer look.
France and Germany are presenting a united front. Their leaders say it is more important than ever that Europe asserts and defends its interests, now that there is a new administration in the United States.
It's a matter of urgency that we use all European instruments to make sure that our companies and farmers have fair competition conditions in a world that is more brutal and uninhibited.
President Emmanuel Macron and Chancellor Olaf Scholz met in Paris on Wednesday, following US President Donald Trump's renewed threats to slap tariffs on Europe.
They don't take our cars at all. They don't take our farm products, essentially. They don't take very much. We have a $350 billion deficit with the European Union. They treat us very, very badly. So they're going to be in for tariffs.
Europe has consistently exported more products to the United States than it imported. In 2023, it had a surplus of goods to the value of 155 billion euros. However, when it came to services, it was the US with 104 billion euros in surplus. It's not the first time the relationship has faced hurdles. In Trump's first term, he implemented tariffs on European steel and aluminium. In return, the EU imposed tariffs on Harley-Davidsons and American whiskey. This time round, the landscape is different, with Europe's economies facing sluggish growth.
The ability to retaliate is more limited for sellers than for buyers, right? If you need access to consumers in order to keep your economy growing and you don't have domestic demand, which has been the case in China and in Germany, that does limit the degrees of freedom.
Regardless, the EU chief says the bloc stands ready to protect its interests.
And finally, for business, good news for Europe's green energy transition, as a new report shows the bloc's growing use of renewables.
That report showing the European Union set a new record for clean energy production and use last year, with 40% of the bloc's electricity coming from solar and other renewables. Add to that the 24% coming from nuclear, and you have nearly 3/4 of the bloc's power that results in no greenhouse gas emissions. The 2019 European Green Deal saw the EU aim for cutting 55% of emissions by the end of the decade. Since then, the energy transition is estimated to have saved the bloc some $61 billion worth of fossil fuel imports. The report is a rare bright spot in a world that is largely failing to pivot away from fossil fuels quickly enough to avoid the worst effects of climate change, with both the US and China producing more than 2/3 of their power via fossil fuels. The arrival of Donald Trump and his quick reversal of Joe Biden's climate policies boding ill for the planet's future. Here's one of the report's lead authors.
The world needs climate leaders now more than ever. And the transition in Europe is about two things mainly, as I see it. It's about increasing European energy independence, and it's about showing this climate leadership. And those two things, given the ascendancy of Trump, I think just gain in importance.
And that's it for business, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Brian Quinn.